over the past few years, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years, about 12 young men and women who attended this group have left us. Not that they have died, but in a way they have died. They have died to the world in as much as they are now consecrated to God, body and soul, men and women. 2 of them are at a seminary in Germany or in the US, 2 of them at another seminary in Tuscany. One young woman is a nun in Naples and recently moved to this country. Another one is a nun in San Giovanni Rotondo in Italy. Another one is a nun in Gower, Missouri, a Benedictine monastery. Another one went to Minneapolis in the US and is in a small religious community recently founded. Another one just entered in August in this country in England in a Carmel in Birkenhead. And a young man is a Franciscan in Gosport in the south of England. Another one is a Redemptorist in Scotland, very, very far north from here. And I hope I don't forget anyone. Just to give you, this wonderful news and quite surprising news, because it doesn't seem that we are at a time when young adults should be particularly encouraged to enter religious life. It seems rather that the assaults of modernity upon our faith, our devotion, our church have been so successful and relentless that we sometimes wonder what is left. And so, is it really a good time to make such a leap of faith and dedicate ourselves to God, body and soul, in a consecrated life? I was surprised to see so many of them entering consecrated life. I've been in this country 20 years, and certainly from the start, I have urged on young people in particular the importance of listening to God's will, of discerning the holy will of God on us while we are at a stage in our lives when we haven't yet committed to this or that option. And for all my preaching, there seemed to be little response. And yet the times were to some extent easier 20 years ago than they are now. And so it's a surprise to me that in the last 2 and 3 years, coinciding with lockdown, with great difficulties of traveling or visiting a house to have an idea of the place, despite all these unprecedented obstacles, we have that dozen young men, young women who, as we speak, are wearing a holy habit, a cassock or a monk's habit, or a sister's and a veil, a wimple, and they are in various places all over the world, in America and in Europe. And nobody forced them to go there. As I said, rather it was more difficult now than it was before. So it's a surprise. I hope it's not an unhappy surprise. I hope, like me, you feel a particular interest in what they have done and chosen or answered. You may know some of them, you may remember them, you may have seen them on pictures. For instance, that weekend we had at Dowie Abbey, was it before lockdown, some 2 years ago, and quite fascinating on the picture, you can see like more than half of the faces are people who are now in consecrated life. And so, like me, I hope you are happy to hear of that good news. You are possibly surprised. Unlike me, you are perhaps afraid, thinking, who's next? Thinking, what does God want for me? Is God going to drag me into a cloister, into a monastery, into a seminary? There's an element of perhaps of anxiety, thinking, I don't mind thinking about it, I don't mind, looking at the pros and cons, but I surely don't want to be pushed into something against my will. And what if I am, in the secret of my heart, kneeling by my bed this evening? What if I am to tell God and Our Lady, please do with me what you want? What if I tell that to them very earnestly? Are they not going perhaps to take me to my word? And am I going to hear a voice, okay, Carmel tomorrow morning, or seminary or monastery? Am I going to hear such an imperative and clear injunction, a calling? And if I hear it, am I not going to be uncomfortable, afraid, feeling unprepared, etc.? I wish we could have present here these 12 young men and women, because then we could just ask them. They would be sitting here with their habits, and we could, after this talk, when we have a chat, we could say, how did you feel? How did it happen? Was it like a dream? Was it something that fell upon you? Is it your mother and father forced you into it, or this priest or whoever? What was the influence? How did it happen? Well, they're not here, although I'm sure in spirit they are here, because no doubt they pray for more of you, young people of their generation, to be freed from the hindrances of the world, at least to be able to listen to what God has to tell you. Certainly, they will have realized a first principle which St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, reminds us of in his spiritual exercises, that, I quote from memory, that man is created by God to know, love, and serve God in this world, and to be happy forever with God in the next life, in eternity. And from that principle, it follows that man must therefore make use of created goods inasmuch as those bring him closer to God, while man must turn away from created goods inasmuch as the same goods distract him from moving closer to God. So these are two very simple principles indeed, that we are here on earth with an end, a purpose, a finality, that is to get to know God, to be with God forever in heaven. And because of that end, of that purpose clearly defined, without any sort of doubt, then we have a strategy. Whatever stands before us and God is to be used as a means to bring us closer to God. And all these things are good in themselves, inasmuch as they are created by God. The things we eat, where we sleep, our friends, the beauty of nature, the music we listen to, etc. All these things in themselves are good. But as we all have experienced, they can become obstacles to our fulfillment in grace, in our relationship with God, if we are not careful, if we are not reminded often of what it's all about, where we are going, to whom we are going. Dear friends, even outside of a day of reflection on vocation to consecrated life, it is a certainty that what matters is union with God. God is a communion of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. supremely fulfilled in that exchange of love, uncreated. And therefore God, in his bounty, when he created us, invited us, by the very fact that we were created after his image and likeness, and that with reason and free will, invited us to participate in that exchange of love. Just like the three divine persons are essentially, substantially united with each other, well, we are called to as deep a union as possible with such a loving Creator. Think of anything you like to do, any place you like to be. I can assure you that this is less interesting, less rewarding, less fulfilling than to be with God forever in heaven, starting here on earth. You know that, you've heard it before, but the world is very clever to distract you, and so it's so important to be reminded of it frequently, in fact, every day, in fact, all the time. That's the great secret of the saints, that they have managed to cultivate this union with God, so that whatever they were doing day and night, even when they sleep, so to speak, they mean to be united with God. We need to have the proper understanding of the time we spend on earth. This time takes its meaning from its end. Real things will begin when we enter blessed eternity with God. All that takes place between our conception and our death, hopefully in the state of grace, all these things are a preparation for eternity. As a preparation, they are less important. In duration, they are, these things and years spent on earth, infinitely smaller, quicker, shorter than what we will do in heaven, when you think that eternity means forever and ever and ever, world without end. However short, however inferior in value these things are compared with eternity, they are of an essential importance, because they and only they, these things, these years spent on earth, determine where and how we will spend our eternity. If we live and die well, we will spend a blessed eternity with God. If we live, but especially die, in evil ways, away from God and His grace, having rejected it, then we will spend our eternity in the same spiritual posture that is in hell, where God is hated. So you see, a very small amount of time spent on earth compared with eternity. The things we do on earth compared with the splendors of heaven they don't compare. And yet, they are so important because they are the threshold, the necessary, however short, preparation and decision for where we spend our eternity. Modern science tells us with many details and great accuracy about life before birth, life in the womb. So less than before, men can ignore what is taking place in the womb, the splendor, the beauty, the wonder of this growth in one's mother's womb. These 9 months spent in the womb are, of course, less important than perhaps the 9 decades spent on earth after birth. And yet, you see my analogy, and yet they are decisive, because during the 9 months in the womb, there isn't 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour, which is not entirely, essentially designed and meant as a preparation for life after birth. So you can apply this beautiful and very real analogy to the spiritual realm. Just as we spent 40, 50, 100 years on earth, and it is short, and it is not a lot we can do compared with the saints in heaven, and yet it determines what comes after. So, dear friends, we must discern what is the holy will of God for us. As I speak in the church next door, a baptism is taking place. A little baby is becoming a child of God. He or she is being adopted by God and will be able to say, like we do, our Father, to call God his or her Father in a real spiritual sense. I believe all of us here, if not all, are baptized. If you are not baptized, you are very welcome to meditate on the meaning of life with us this morning. If we are baptized, we have received this calling. So the general calling as a baptized person is to go to our Father. As simple as that. To go to our Father. The question, therefore, is not so much what the calling is, as how can we answer it? What is the safer or safest route for us to throw ourselves into the arms of such a loving Father? The general path is that of daily sanctification. And this is why, from an early age, when we were baptized, or later, if we became Catholic as adults, we were taught to pray every day, to cultivate a life of virtue, to avoid the occasions of sin, to turn away from bad company, and to simply stop bad or harmful or dangerous activities, leisure, etc. This is simply common sense for anyone who wants to reach the final destination of eternal happiness. As we grow in age and experience, we are also invited to commit ourselves in a more permanent way through the choice of a state of life. Most people will be called, so to speak, to remain in the world and to find a good spouse, to found a family, and to be therefore a wonderful example in society of what the relationship between God and the soul is. Analogically, it is what the husband and the wife are to mirror, and that very fecundity of God, which is replicated analogically by the spouses when they become parents and transmit life to their children. This is the general calling, or the more ordinary path which is walked by most people around us. When I say that, in fact, I must correct that, sadly, it seems to become the minority of those who are in the world and yet found a family and commit to God and a spouse through the vows of holy matrimony. Sadly, many young people, or not young, do not know or believe in such a hallowed path and prefer to be moved by circumstances and instinct rather than by their soul and the grace of God and the guidance of the Church. To some extent, therefore, we could say that, sadly, even matrimony has become a sort of an election. I will not act as a pagan, as a savage, as a beast. I will act as a human being in the world. That's already a good choice, and I congratulate you if it is yours. But within that scope, it is possible indeed to be more specific, and God therefore does call some young people to surrender themselves to Him, body and soul, in what we call consecrated life. By implication, these people will renounce the legitimate joys of marriage and the family. They will consecrate themselves to God in holy celibacy. They therefore renounce objective goods given by God, such as the companionship of one's spouse, the affection of one's children, and the sort of power of decision over one's life in the choice of a job, of a career, of a holiday destination, even of one's car and clothes. Yes, they renounce all this. It will be all organized for them by the community, the rule, under which they choose to spend their time on earth. To clarify a bit the picture, there are two main options. Either one remains in the world, and generally it will mean to get married and found a good family, or one joins a way of consecration, body and soul. In that path of consecration, there are, again, two ways. One is to become a priest, and this is open only to men. And the other, which is open also to our wonderful young ladies, is to become a religious. Within the priesthood, for men, there are two main subcategories. One is to be a priest in a diocese, that is a territory with boundaries under the authority of a bishop appointed by the successor of Peter, Pope Francis, in Rome, and in communion with that same bishop and with the Pope. Or a priest can be in a community, and that again encompasses a certain range of options. You can be a priest as a Jesuit priest, or a Dominican, or the Fraternity of St. Peter, for instance, or the Oratory here in London and other places. So all these communities, each of them with its own charism. Obviously, the community also has to be located somewhere and in communion with the local bishop, in communion with the Pope. Within religious life, you have two main subcategories. One is to be a contemplative, and the other is to be apostolic. Contemplative religious life is organized around prayer. Contemplative orders are, for instance, the Carthusians, the Benedictines, the Carmelites, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and many others. Within Dominican Franciscan, especially for nuns, there are various ways, so I won't go into details. But what all these paths have in common is that life is organized around prayer. That is their main business. That's their job. That's their mission. So the horarium of the day, the schedule of the day, the timetable is all rhythmed and paced according to prayer. There will be prayer alone in one's room, like the Carthusians. They live in one house, each of them separate from the others, and most of the time they are in that little house where they are, and at a certain time, when the bell of the abbey church rings, they get out of bed, and they fall on their knees in their little oratory there, and they start silent prayer, or whatever it is, at a certain time, all of them together, but not visibly together, because they are in separate houses. And so at a certain time, I don't know, half an hour, 1 hour of silent prayer, later on, this part of the divine office, and then reading time, and then manual labor. They would, I don't know, chop wood for their stove in their cell, or this or that thing. But again, like the Benedictines, whose emphasis is more on liturgical prayer, prayed in the abbey church, in the choir stalls, with more ornate liturgy and possibly music. Like the Carmelites, who also have silent prayer at the heart of the charism, with 1 full hour of contemplation meditation in the morning and another full hour in the afternoon, or the Dominican, Franciscan, and many others. This is all centered, organized around prayer. And because of that, to foster a life of prayer, they choose to spend their entire lives within the same 4 walls. They will not go out, not even for shopping, not even to bury their parents. Now that sounds like really, really harsh. I think, come on, I mean, surely there would be an exception. Well, I can't speak for every order, and perhaps there will be some exceptions. But generally speaking, when you enter such an order, especially a traditional one, who would have kept its original traditions or would have restored them, then your way of communicating with the outside world is through prayer, not through visual or vocal contact. This, of course, takes a deep faith. You cannot survive in that setting unless you have become deeply convinced that real communication is with God and through God. So that, I'm going to say something a bit shocking for many of you, I'm sorry, but they do not even have Facebook or Twitter or a smartphone, or in fact, they don't have anything that kind at all. And they are not cut off from real communication. In fact, they are the best communicants we have in this day and age, because they are constantly tuned in the God channel. They speak with the saints, and they do not forget their family and friends outside the walls. They very much pray for their friends and family. They intercede for their friends and families. The second option within religious life, after contemplative life, is apostolic life. And this, again, encompasses quite a diversity of options. It could be an order dedicated to nursing the sick and the elderly. Beautiful thing. In fact, that's one of my pet wishes. We need it back. We used to have this everywhere, and old people and the sick would have the great benefit of being supported in their illness by consecrated people who would do it entirely for God and neighbor. I know that many professional nurses do it with great dedication as well, and especially if they are Christian or Catholic, they can certainly do a lot of good there. But there's nothing like entering a hospital or a nursing home where all the staff are consecrated celibates to God and look after you as a sick person or elderly by virtue of a total surrender to Christ. And it is Christ they see in you and seek in you and serve in you. We need that back. We had it everywhere, all the time, and in the past 50 years, it has collapsed. And now, it grieves me to think that most of our elderly people and sick people at best prepare for death with a television set with the latest series of Netflix in front of them as the ultimate preparation for standing before their judge. It's not going to help. I mean, there are some good films sometimes, but generally speaking, you want consecrated people around you. So that's what's one option, and please ask God that it be restarted. Teaching order. Again, once people are born, they need to be shown the way to heaven. And so we need, again, men and women, religious nuns, friars, whoever they are, dedicated to teaching in schools, young people and less young. Very important. Previous generations were taught by these people. The media are very expert telling us about the failures of that system and how abuse and severity and cruelty went on. And you really wonder how parents at the time, would send their children to these places if they were essentially wicked. Yes, there can be failures, but it does not represent the essence and mission of these places. And indeed, for one failure, there would have been 1,000 successes. So friends, let us also think of that. We need people who are dedicated to God, body and soul, and who are therefore able to consecrate themselves to bringing young souls closer to God in the beautiful vocation of teachers. Another apostolic path is to be a missionary. And certainly in territories where as yet Christ is not well known, perhaps where the church is persecuted, and then missionary, as in times past, might mean to be ready for martyrdom, yes, or at least imprisonment. Sadly, we are now in the former Christian West in lands of mission again. And so the mission starts also here at home, in London, etc. It's a bit perplexing that the only people knocking at everybody's door on behalf of their faith seems to be the Jehovah's Witnesses. Where are we, the Catholics? We know the true faith. We are indeed religion, and yet we are not heard much knocking at people's doors, starting with me. There is a problem there. So, to be a missionary and to be dedicated to God and the service of neighbor in that path. Before we conclude this morning talk, I will speak now about the three evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They come in that order of precedence, starting with poverty, leading into chastity, and culminating with obedience. Remember what St. Ignatius Loyola, who founded the order to which Pope Francis belongs, told us. Created goods are good in themselves as they come from God, but they must be used according to God's intention. And so when they become obstacle, then we must regulate our access to them. The vocation of every baptized person will dictate certain choices and use of things and relationship with persons. And there will be things which, or actions, or relationships, which will always be sinful. And so, regardless of being consecrated to God as a nun or as a monk or a priest, one mustn't do that. That's all. So there is the ordinary cultivation of virtue for any baptized person, and that is what all of you strive to do. Those who are called to consecrated life go a bit further. They answer a call to practicing virtue at a deeper level, and they will renounce things which are good in themselves, but precisely they will offer up a sacrifice to God. So poverty is the virtue, and if one is consecrated to God, the vow, through which one formally renounces the free, autonomous use of possessions. So if we have a house, if we own a car, if we have a bank account with some money on it, if we expect an inheritance from our parents, from our auntie somewhere, all these things are renounced once and forever. Since we need food and a bed and heating and the bills of the convent and monastery need to be paid, it's fair that these things be in fact transferred, the ownership and use of them, to the community who welcomes us in its bosom. It's not always the case, but it is generally what happens. So through that vow and commitment to poverty, in fact, we seem to be losing something. I won't have this and that. I won't be able to choose what to buy, etc., what to wear. But in fact, it is a liberation, because all these things take a lot of our time, of our attention, of our energy. And this, to some extent, is legitimate as long as we are in the world. But precisely, that's the great benefit of entering religious life, that it's all organized for us. The house where we live has been paid for, is being assessed, cleaned, there is fire alarm checks, and all these things are done for us by the bursar of the community and whoever is involved there. So we don't need to look for the latest, update from the estate agent telling us, oh yes, the 2-bedroom flat you've been looking for is now available, and I know it's gone already because there is so much of a demand. So it was on your screen for 20 seconds, and you were already running there, and now it's too late. And that 20 times a day. And so all these things which make life in the world so stressful, difficult, all this is taken away through the vow of poverty. It's all provided for you. Where to buy food, how to cook it, it's all organized for you. It's all there. There is somebody in charge of the food there. If you are a mendicant order, well then you will be knocking at the doors this time to ask for bread, or you go at Tesco at the rear and ask if they have any unsold items, and if you're lucky perhaps you will get some. So poverty, a liberation from all the cares, worries of material things. Chastity, to be given to God completely body and soul. After all, in heaven, there won't be the use of our body in the sense that spouses may use it legitimately while on earth. In heaven, yes, our bodies will be reunited to our souls, but in a constant action of contemplation of God. There will not be any further human beings created. The number of the elect will have been defined, and we will just be using all that we are and be fulfilled in the possession of our body, completely under the mastering of our soul, so no tearing apart of the soul and the body with concupiscence and evil desires. Everything will be under the mastery of the soul. Why? Because the soul will be filled with divine grace. So that's the way it works. Divine grace comes into the soul, and therefore the soul regains mastery of the body, of the senses, which it had lost through the original sin inherited by us from our first parents. On earth, certainly chastity is a problem, possibly more than poverty. And absolutely when we are in the world. This interesting device, the internet and telephones and computers have been twisted by the devil to become vistas into hell. And who are the young people currently unscathed by the grave sin of pornography? Sadly, even children just the age of reason or below, are now exposed to that curse of pornography because of the internet and all having a telephone with images in their pocket. Not that every child is has bad inclination or at least responds to them or is aware of them, but it only takes one friend who has been involved in these things once, who out of silly curiosity, not understanding really what it's all about, but will share it with his playmates on the playground at school, and there you have a wound, a terrible scar in the innocence of that young child. Later on, when we become more aware of what is at stake, we still may have to fight a battle to keep away from these pictures and videos. This is sometimes a real addiction. There are men and women who are completely addicted to this. What a curse. What a terrible thing. I'm going to sound like an old man, but when I was young, there was no internet, would you believe it? There were no mobile phones. Incredible. But one of the good things is that if somebody were tempted to sin with graphic images, he had to go out, walk on the pavement, go to not only a newsagent, but, as I assume, somewhere in the back shelves of a gloomy bookshop, he will, with trembling and some level of shame, I assume, at least at the beginning, would indicate to the seller that he was after that kind of material. And he would need to take out of his purse some coins to buy the item and in exchange receive the magazine in his hand, then hide it under his elbow and hide further into some dark corner of his house or a public place to satisfy this bestial curiosity. So you see there was a whole process, as I imagine it, and every step in the process was an opportunity to stop. Because you had to do all these things, you were more likely to be deterred from reaching completion in the evil process. By contrast, now you only need to swipe your finger on the screen and the devil appears. No need to go out, no need to pay with coin, no need to hide. It's all there at the tip of your fingers. So friends, not to dwell too long on this sorry topic, but being realistic, knowing well also as a confessor that it is a curse of the modern world, we need to appreciate, on the one hand, what a hindrance it is to our freedom, to our growth in grace, and therefore, as a consequence, what a benefit it is to be protected from it through the vows of religion or a consecration to God, whereby the very device is taken away from us. If anything, we will use the computer screen in the common room of the convent to order, I don't know, incense for the church or bread for the community. That will be our involvement into the internet. But when we are back in ourselves, we know that there isn't such a device there in the drawer or on our bed table. We know that there isn't the physical possibility for that finger to go to that screen and to activate this website, the vista into hell. That doesn't exist. It's not available for us. We have renounced it. And so, if you think you are weak, if you have experienced that, this is a temptation difficult to resist, then ask yourself where your salvation is better secured. Is it with access to such a device or without access to it? That is something to think about seriously. And even if we now move from pornography to other curses, there is also all that pornography and the sexualization of the world in which we live will lead us to the condoning of self-abuse, understood as something hygienic and manly or womanly. Fornication, understood as an interesting sport and not at all as the twisting of the beautiful sexual faculties entrusted by God to those called to become parents when united in holy matrimony. And all the panoply of evils connected with that, contraception, abortion, etc. Friends, yes, within the beautiful boundaries of holy matrimony, yes, sexuality is a gift from God, and even then, not one easy to make use of according to true sanctification. Remember, the purpose of sexuality is to give life to children, to raise them as saints, that they may die in the state of grace and, with their parents, populate heaven to worship the Holy Trinity. That is the only purpose of sex. So even within marriage, a lot of self-mastery is to be acquired so as to use sexuality according to God's will and therefore not against one's sanctification. Any use of sexuality which is purposely disconnected from the possibility of conceiving children within marriage, any such use of sexuality is sinful. The more one is aware of the sin, the graver it becomes. That's something I need to insist upon, because sometimes the world will give us that false threat or deterrent, saying, you don't want to consecrate yourself to God, body and soul, because then there is no sex at all anymore. Supposing that, if you remain in the world without being lawfully married to your wife or husband, you do have, to some extent, a possibility of being, as one poetically puts it, sexually active. Well, this is a mistake or a lie. There are two categories: those who are lawfully married and those who are not. In this room, I know of at least one couple lawfully married, but everybody else, you and me, we are in the other category, when we are not allowed to be sexually active because we are not in a position to beget children and raise them in the fear, knowledge, and love of God. I, because I chose not to do it, being consecrated to God as a priest. You, because you are not yet married, if such should be your calling. The sexual activity is presented by the world as a need. This is just not true. It's just not true. A physical need is to breathe. Try and go without breathing for a while. It won't last very, very long, perhaps a few minutes. What else? To eat. That can last a few weeks, okay? But after a few weeks, normally, you will see that the need is stronger and either you die or you eat your sandwich. And to drink, that also is quite necessary, I think, at least once a day. And to sleep. There is sleep deprivation in the tortures by the communists, but normally after a couple of days, well, you become mad and you die. So these are really the physical needs: to breathe, to eat, to drink, and to sleep. But sex isn't part of it. Absolutely not. So don't be mistaken when the mantras of the world tell you, of course, for a healthy life, for a happy balance, a fulfillment of a modern man or woman, you need to be sexually active. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. These are the words of a slave, of a fool, of an ignorant, or of a demon. Choose. These are not the words and counsels of a human being who understands where he comes from and where he's going. I would say, even outside of religion, anyone should agree with what I've said. It's just clinical. Leave people without sexual activity for a while, they will not die. Not at all. In fact, of course, if they are taught a bit what they are doing on earth, they will strive. They will strive. Look at the saints. Look at so many people you know who are consecrated celibates, and you will see that to free that part of our being and activity and shift the capacity for love and for embrace to God and the chaste service of neighbor. This, in fact, is a fulfillment which is beyond all the joys of marital intimacy. And indeed, those consecrated to God are called to be icons of the love of God for man. They renounce legitimate joys of marriage here below, so as to point at eternity. In eternity, already on earth, but in eternity forever, we will be united with God, as was my beginning in this talk. United with God, we will never lose that union with God. And so, those who choose not to be exclusively united with the opposite sex while on earth in holy matrimony, they tell us in a silent and beautiful way, I await and I prepare for a union with the lover, with a capital L, God himself, who is love, for whom love is not a quality, but his very being. It is therefore a prophetic mission and calling, that of chastity, especially when vowed in the religious state. And just like the love of God is fecund, well, there will be a spiritual fecundity of those consecrated to God in holy celibacy. Through their prayer, through their life of sacrifice, through their kindness and tenderness, there will be a lot of divine love being shared being represented, embodied, and it will help other men and women, children, adults, to come closer to God. And indeed, analogically, this is a spiritual fecundity, which is the experience we have. Think of, to take a saint, perhaps closer to us in the modern world, but Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I mean, you see that old little wrinkled woman, and she is a mother. Mother Teresa, she's really a mother. Motherhood speaks through her in a way which is amazing, attractive, beautiful, enriching. And this same with so many consecrated women whom we may know, or simply those we imagine in the convents. I need to end because we have Holy Mass now, and so we will continue in this afternoon talk with the third of the three vows, and that is that of obedience, perhaps the most costly one, but one which is the finishing touch to our consecration to God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.